Steve Chadwick.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's wonderful, actually, to be back debating this bill, and I think each time we come to the House we're all learning so much more, and I want to acknowledge the sponsor of the bill, Grant Robertson, and the Chair, who's demonstrating really an in-depth knowledge and a passion for the subject and bringing the Royal Society Bill to the House today. And I was a bit disappointed to hear a usually very reasonable colleague, Louise Upston, in government over there calling out about how many women are there. Well, you know, there are women that can be fellows too. I'm sure the member for Taupo will be delighted. And she talked about equity issues, and I think that's not for politicians to decide, and you'll be pleased to know in this section in Clause 9 that in Clause 9 this is something that's left entirely to the Academic Executive Committee. And I am not sure if the sponsor of the bill and the Chair can clarify whether or not this Academic Executive Committee does look at grounds of equity, does look at Māori representation as well as extension to include the humanities that this bill proposes at the request of the Royal Society. But I dare say we'll be revisiting this bill probably in the future, and they may be asking us to include something else in the future. And I congratulate our colleague Tudor Flavel for including an amendment that does take into account te reo Māori, and I think that's a wonderful addition along with the humanities. And when you know that you've got Professor Balich contributing as a fellow with 366 other wonderful New Zealanders, we can see that there's a role for other fantastic New Zealanders to be considered by the Royal Society of New Zealand for perhaps this honorary fellowship in the future, the status of fellowship that's clarified here in Clause 9.1. One of the issues that I don't know, and perhaps the sponsor of the bill could clarify, and this is a serious issue, whether these fellowships are ever awarded posthumously, because I do in the House today seriously want to acknowledge the contribution of a wonderful gentleman who has been buried today here in Wellington, and that's Dr. Lindsay Haas, actually a world-renowned neurologist who has worked in the field of Guillain-Barré, a very obscure condition linked with eating contaminated chicken. Now, we have some neurologists in this country that may never have been nominated by the Royal Society to be recognised as a fellow. But I want to say in our dealings with Dr. Lindsay Haas, actually a very compassionate, passionate and humane New Zealander as a neurologist and leading expert in this field in the world, it would be wonderful if posthumous recognition of fellowships could be considered. And I seriously don't know if that is part of the brief of this Academic Executive Committee that looks at these allocation of fellowships. When you think there are 366, actually that list that Mr Robertson referred to, they are our iconic New Zealanders. Knowing Dr Lindsay Haas as I do, and the acknowledgements that came from neurologists all around the world today at his funeral service, he was a fairly fundamental Kiwi bloke with a new migrant family from Germany settled here in New Zealand, and I don't think he ever saw himself as needing or warranting the status of fellowship in order for him to contribute back to the field of medical science. But sometimes these are awards acknowledged by their own contemporaries and by their own peers, and that's where for fellows in the Royal Society, that is the greatest recognition of their contribution to science in New Zealand. So in the House, it's a privilege to acknowledge Dr Lindsay Haas's contribution to New Zealand society and to medicine. You know, he was the sort of practitioner that used to have a library around him in the Wellington School of Medicine that other neurologists envied envied, and he could pull out the research proposal and say, actually, this sort of methodology, Mr Chair, Mr Chair, I'm happy to take a call on this bill and commend Grant Robertson for the types of amendments that I think, had they have been introduced some 30 years ago, you would have seen some of the most esteemed Māori academics come through. I fathom that probably out of the 366 current fellows, not 2% would be Māori. And the reason for that is simply this. The entry point in terms of academic excellence and the recognition of that historically amongst Māori was really in the area, the subject area of the humanities, our language, our art, our culture. So if I were to cast my mind back, and certainly Steve Chadwick prompted me to think about some of those early experts and academics, they would be people like Te Rangihiroa, Sir Peter Buck, Maharaya Winiata, Maui Pomare, who was a former member of this House, and a doctor who introduced the Tohunga Suppression Act, actually, by the way. Hoani Waititi, who died before his time, Professor Kawharu, John Rangiho. Those are some of the recognised leaders in our academic areas that have now passed on, that could have been recognised had an amendment like this have been introduced. These days we have more contemporary figures like Mason Jury, Dr Linda Smith, Pātu Hohepa, I think, and also there are many more. Now, I think this type of amendment does make way for recognised leaders and experts who are proficient in all manner of the humanities subject area, but specifically a number of Māori that could certainly now be recognised as being leaders in their field of study. And I think that is something that we can embrace as very much a progressive move of the Royal Society. I have heard the Society referred to as an old boys club. That prides itself on its small membership and its patch protection. I'm pleased that a Labour member has sought to advance their interests to open up the field, so to speak, to be more inclusive in this area. I should mention, by the way, if there was posthumous recognition, certainly within my own tribe, you would go no further than Peitahuri Nui Jones, who made a huge contribution to the wealth of knowledge and retention of tribal histories and language and culture within our own tribe, and he was certainly recognised in the same regard that the people of Ngāti Porou recognised the contribution of Apirana Ngata. Mr Speaker, this clause, as Grant Robertson had clarified, was a opening up of a process to be able to recognise people's contribution, expertise and appoint them. I have a question to Grant in terms of promoting this cause. Was it in fact intended that there could be an opportunity for posthumous recognition? And if that was discussed when you were putting this bill together with the Royal Society, could it be an opportunity to recognise those of the humanities posthumously? So I think that becomes a question of some significance, because the Royal Society is moving with the times. They're certainly broadening the inclusion of subject areas in terms of their role with the society, and they recognise actually that more and more scholarship is being done in the area of humanities that are going to help our society overall. I look at some of the previous awarding of scholarships in the areas of improving teachers, the role of teachers in the classroom. I look at a number of funded scholarship projects, certainly at Waikato University, and I know that the academics there have made a huge contribution to advance teaching practices in the classroom. In fact, Te Kotahitanga is but one
of the current initiatives that has been promoted through Waikato University and had a huge impact on improving the achievement levels of Māori within our schools, our mainstream schools in particular. Kia ora.